Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. This is a Comprehensivist Wednesday that we do in collaboration with the Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society. And it is amazing to have Sanjay back. We've been doing this series on neuroscience, and we are getting into consciousness. And we're going to try to see if we can talk about consciousness together. So let me hand it over to Sanjay. Sanjay, floor is all yours.
Thanks, Shrikant. So tonight, so the topic that I chose is it's a topic that will help us to understand consciousness. In previous talks that we've had, I've tried to raise that, and I've tried to get people to understand exactly, at least from the world of neuroscience, what is consciousness seen as? I mean, there are tons and tons of research, especially in the last 1.5 decades, where it really picked up. And there's so much understanding now, but that understanding is not in the public eye, not in the public mind. And I think it's important for us because this is something, there are many things that, day to day, we try to understand about the world, including ourselves. But if we don't have a good understanding of what really drives our behavior, for example, consciousness, and how conscious we are of the things of our behavior, for example, it can give us a distorted sense of what happens. So blind sight is a simple idea to understand, but the consequence of what it really means, what it points to in terms of function within our brain, is pretty profound. And so I chose that because it's fairly, again, it is simple to understand. And so tonight what we're going to do is I have some slides. I'll start those in a minute, just to introduce what blind, for those who weren't able to read or see the videos. I'll try to introduce a little bit, but I would recommend, if you have time later, to watch them, because they will add to your understanding of this. And then after that, what we'll do after the slides is we'll have discussion with the idea of using blind sight to delve into what it says about consciousness, about human consciousness. And in prior talks, I've talked about consciousness, but and I've elaborated that consciousness occurs at many levels. For example, it also occurs in animals, even lower animals, not just the higher primates, but consciousness, it's a very complicated thing. It's not simply what we think of as human consciousness, which is the highest level. Within us, we actually have many levels of consciousness, and in prior talks we've gone into those. I won't do that again. So let me just pull up the slide, and I'll start to I'll talk as the slides are visible, hopefully, to everyone. So overall, what we want to do is introducing blind sight. So the first idea around blind sight is that first let me go into normal vision. So this is a simple schematic slide. It's a top-down view. So if the camera was above our head, the camera was looking down, this is what it would see with our brain. The two circles at the front, at the top part of the image, are our eyes, or the eye sockets and the eyeballs themselves. That bluish, the cyan magenta kind of color span is the field of view that's in front of this person. And the reddish magenta color is the left field of view, and the bluish cyan is the right field of view. And what's important here is to understand that whatever is on the left side of our field of view actually goes into our right side of our brain, okay, the right hemisphere, and vice versa. Whatever is on the right side in front of us goes into our left hemisphere of the brain. And it's actually not that simple. It's actually, and I went into this into earlier talk, but within each eye, there's a right and left section. So our left eye itself sees both the right and left in front of us. So that gets split into two sections. And this actually happens also at the top and bottom. So actually the eye has 4 segments that is split. And all of those 4 segments from each eye, so the 8 segments total, get swapped around inside our brain. That's what that crisscross section is in the middle. It's getting swapped around, and the right information is going to the correct area of the brain in the rear. Our visual system, our visual cortex, is in the rightmost, the rear part of our brain, which is called the occipital lobe. And so all of that information goes into the back, and it's the correct information is in the correct place. So this is normal vision. So when we see something out of our right eye, it ends up, and actually we're seeing it in our left eye too. So whatever is on the right side of us ends up in our left brain, and then we have an awareness. Now there's another part of this that isn't shown in this, but I'll just mention briefly that our two hemispheres also have some characteristic differences in terms of the type of information that they process, not visual, just in general. So there's this very rough characteristic that we're aware of, which it may not be biological. It may actually be sociological that this happens. The reason may be sociological, not necessarily biological, because evidence is not that strong for it to be biological. But our left hemisphere seems to be focused more on logical attributes, and our right hemisphere seems to be focused more on language and reason and intuition and more less theoretical or less logical ideas, whereas the left is focused on that. So then the same thing happens with our visual field, is that anything that goes into our visual field, so something that goes into the left side of our visual field, sorry, the left hemisphere of our visual field. So in this case, it would be this cyan blue color. Anything visual that goes into that area will be interpreted more so using logic, because our left brain tends to be more logical. So, and that's an important aspect to understand, because in a lot of the research that's been done in blindsight especially, what happens is the person is shown one image on the left side and either no image on the right side or a different image on the right side. So basically they're sending different images to each hemisphere of the brain. And one of those images might be something very logical. For example, an equation like 2 + 2. That's logical. Okay, there's no emotions involved in that. And the other hemisphere might be getting a signal such as a lion with its teeth, glaring, showing, which is an emotional image. So they use these types of images to direct information to specific hemisphere of the brain. So that's important to understand. So this was the normal sense of vision. And so just to explain, normal vision requires normal aspects of our visual physiology. So, the hardware, you might say, it has to be normal and functional. Then also we have the parts of our brain, especially the rear section, although it expands further out. The more advanced processing goes into temporal areas also. So the brain itself has to have normal functioning, and it has to be morphologically intact. There shouldn't be any damage. And these two attributes combine to give us a sense of what it is that we're seeing. So we have this sense, we call it a perception, we might call it a realization, and it gives us an awareness that we are seeing something. Okay? And it also gives us an awareness, a realization of what it is that we're seeing, right? That I'm seeing a specific cat, right? Or I'm seeing a person that's familiar to me. What is it? That's also an awareness. And in these bullets, I'm going in progressive order of more complex realization. So the first level, just of the fact that we're seeing, is not very complex. Most animals have that level of understanding. In the middle level, most animals do, but the level of the whatness, the what exactly it is, the complexity of the what, varies among different animals. And the third level is the awareness, and this is mostly in humans, although it is seen in other higher mammals. And that's the awareness that consciously we are seeing, the awareness of being conscious, and that our conscious mind has information going into it, seeing being visual. But it can be the same idea. The idea that we're talking about around blind sight also applies to any of our other senses. So it applies to hearing also. So there's a comparable version of blind sight, which applies to hearing, whereby the person would be the areas of the brain that deal with processing of oral stimuli, of the audio signals. Those areas of the brain are damaged or missing, yet the person has a perception of being able to understand the audio that kind of enters their brain. It's similar to blind sight. So those are the things that happen in a normal sight. Now I'm going to describe roughly what happens in blind sight. So blind sight is where the visual hardware of that person functions correctly. So their eyes, the optic nerve, the optic chiasma, those elements that basically capture the field in front of us, and it sends it, encodes it into specific signals, and transfers that signal into the rear of our brain, into the occipital lobe. All of that is fine. It's working perfectly. And what that means is that the person theoretically should be able to see. Okay. However, what happens is that that person who has blind sight, at least one region of their brain, in particular what's known as the primary visual cortex, it's abbreviated as V1, that area is either damaged or it's missing, and it could be missing many reasons, congenitally, or it may have been removed surgically because of some disease that was being treated, or somehow the V1 region does not perform correctly. And another aspect I need to clarify is blind sight. When we think of blind sight, we think of someone who's completely, they don't have any vision. But blind sight doesn't necessarily mean that they lack complete vision. It may be that a part of their visual field, for example, there may be like a hole that's missing in their visual field, so they see lots of things except for one chunk of their, in front of them. It's like blank. They see nothing in that one region. That also applies to blind sight. If you put something in that invisible region that they can't see, the sensation of blind sight will occur. So these are things that are important to understand, that their eyes and the signal pathway is completely functional, but their brain, the processing part of that, is not functional. That's very important. And so what this does, what ultimately happens in these people, is that they have no awareness of being able to see. Or if they have partial sight, then they see the partial sight, but the area that's missing, that's lacking in vision, in visual acuity and information, that area, they see themselves as completely blind in that area. Okay, and if something is put into that area, they have no conscious awareness of it. Okay, now what's important to mention, and this is the part where we bring in consciousness, is that when and there are many experiments that have done this, but the experiments have gotten progressively more complicated, where they're trying to distill and understand, even to finer gradations of detail, exactly what it is, like the characteristics of their blindsightedness, which part does work, which part doesn't work, what can they see, what can't they see, all the characteristics of this phenomenon. Had been studied in a lot of detail over, and this actually started, it was found for the first time, in terms of the scientific literature, in, I think it was 1972, when it was first, investigated and published. So it's been around for almost 50 years now. So it's a very long-term phenomenon that we've known about, and it's been studied for much of that, although the studying of it has been very, very detailed in roughly the last 20 years. So as far as consciousness, the important point to understand is that the person believes that they are blind or partially blind. And if you ask them anything about, objects or light or motion or anything of that sort, that happens to be in the area that they're blind to, their conscious answer will be, they have no idea. They're clueless. They can't answer. But here's the funny part. The unusual thing is that if you ask them to guess at what's there, in a very, very high percentage of cases, usually 80% or higher, they're almost always correct. So they really cannot see, or they believe they cannot see. They're consciously aware that they cannot see. And any description, any investigation that's been done into their realization, I mean, they have conscious realization of other things. So it's not that they lack consciousness. They have consciousness of all sorts of other things, but their consciousness of the ability to see specific things is truly missing. It's truly deficient. And if you investigate and ask them, challenge them in any sometimes it's that you don't even have to challenge them. Sometimes you do it in an innocuous way, where you put them into a situation where they need to do something using their vision. And I'll talk about some examples. One study that was pretty prominent, which elaborated this very clearly early on. I'll mention that briefly. But you know, if you ask these people, they really don't have a conscious understanding of sight. And then when you ask them to guess at it, they actually do. And what that tells us is that that part of the brain, or the parts of the brain which provides consciousness, which provides conscious awareness, does not have the information going into it. The visual information that's going into the brain somewhere never reaches their conscious parts of the brain. But it does go into other parts of the brain, because when you're asking them these questions, they're able to answer. So in terms of, again, delving into the characteristics of blind sight, so people with blind sight are able to see certain things, perceive, not see in a conscious way, but it's going into the brain, and if you ask them in certain ways, they will answer, usually correctly. So they are able to perceive. That's why the word perceive is in quotes. They're able to perceive, and then there are other things that they're not able to. So I'm going to just roughly describe, and I want to add that this list is not characteristic of every person with blind sight, because the situation of blind sight is so varied. It depends on the region of the brain that was affected, and sometimes it's only one hemisphere. Sometimes it's not the V1 region, but the V1 region only has partial damage. Other regions have much more significant damage. So depending on what it is that happened to that person, some of these attributes may be present, others may not be, or they may have completely different attributes that I didn't bring up here, because it's a very complex area in itself. So, but what we see is, in many cases, majority of cases, if they're shown a picture of a human or animal face, or even a cartoon face, if they're shown a face that has emotions on it, and again, this is the right hemisphere that tends to do this, but left hemisphere is also involved. Both hemispheres are actually involved in doing all these things. So even logical things aren't exclusive to the left hemisphere. Left hemisphere is critical to it, but the right hemisphere also participates and helps. So both hemispheres are important in all this. But what happens is, if you show them faces with emotions on them, the people recognize the emotions even though they can't see it. Even though they have, if you ask them to recognize, is the person facing left or right, they might not be able to answer that, depending on, again, the type of blindsightedness that they have. They won't understand many characteristics of what they're seeing, but something like the emotion, it is in their brain. It somehow has gotten into their brain, and again, that's in the deeper subcortical regions, the emotion processing regions. It gets there. Another thing that we see is very often recognized is movement, especially if it's rapid movement, and it doesn't have to be something large. It could be a small dot, as long as it's bright enough, for them to actually see it. It can be a small dot that's basically moving across, and one of the videos that I linked to was a video that Dr. Weisenkrantz, who was the researcher who was credited to have discovered this, one of the main people. He did a study with one of his initial patients, and that's one of the videos that I linked to, in which he was asking that person to describe, and as you can see, if you saw the video, you would see that that the person didn't have any understanding, and the doctor had also connected some other equipment to the person's mind and their eye, so he could study in depth exactly what the person was doing, where their gaze was, was tracking their retina, tracking the cornea, and thus where their gaze was. So he did a fairly good job of trying to understand why this person was able to see, even though they didn't understand that they were seeing. So movement, again, is something that tends to be prominent. So these other aspects, color, texture, contrast, these are not always present in people with blind sight, but many times they are. And again, it depends on the characteristic. And again, the specific abilities that a person has will depend on the nature of the damage or deficit that exists in their brain. There are things that they oftentimes don't notice. So, for example, I mentioned earlier, specific features or details of what they're seeing. Okay, unless it's prominent, unless it's something like a very bright red object within the field of view, that bright red will be more noticeable, because color tends to be, especially certain colors, tend to be more noticeable to everyone, not just to people with blind sight. But if you try to ask them to describe, for example, if it is a face that they're looking at with the emotions, if you try to ask them what are the shape of the eyebrows of that face, they usually won't be able to go into that level of detail because the processing tends to be at a high level. They notice the facial expression. Actually, when I was describing the emotions of faces, one of the things that has happened is the person who is looking, the person with blindsight, when they're looking at that face, they won't recognize what they're seeing. But on their face, the researchers see that their face themselves take on a similar emotion to what they're seeing. Even though, so for example, if the face that they're shown has sadness, that person's own face will start to show sadness, even though they're not aware that they're doing that. This is purely subconscious. They do it subconsciously. So these are just more aspects of it, which elaborates on the depth of understanding that their brain has of what they're seeing, but at the same time, the complete lack of awareness, of conscious awareness of what's happening. So specific features, they're usually not able, and again, slow-moving objects are not very noticeable. And also what's important here is that the effect is hemispheric. So earlier when I talked about that something logical, if you show them an equation 2 plus 2, right? Well, that will have a stronger signal in the left part of the brain. And so if during the research, that's what they did, is they put it in front of the right side of their visual field, an equation, which is logical, right? Because that's going to go into the left hemisphere. So that's how you can control what information you're sending and if that information is meaningful or not to the person. So that's an effect that happens in normal people, but this also happens in people with blind sight. What I want to do next is I want to, and this is very important, I wanted to give a sense of what is blind sight. Okay, and it's impossible because I think most of the people who are here have sight. We've had sight for most of our all of our lives, and so it's very difficult. But I'm going to try to do this in a way that might, well, let's see. I mean, it's a visual example, and what we'll do is we'll start with a very simple field, and I'm assuming everybody can see this, but it's basically a picture of a person. And I'm going to slowly have this picture fade out. Okay, it's going to get fainter and fainter and fainter. Okay, and as the image gets fainter and fainter and fainter, okay, you can still see we can now, especially if you're looking at this in a room that's very dark. So most of us are not in a room that's dark, so it will be harder. But if this were in a completely dark room, our eyes are more sensitive and it can see more. The last few slides you might not be able to see because you're in a brightly lit room. But as this gets more, so now at this point it's difficult. But if you look in the left corner, over here, you can still see some, most people would be able to see that there's something here. And also over here, you can kind of see a bluish hint, right? So you can somewhat see that there are elements of this picture still there. And as it goes further down, it pretty much disappears. So at this point, very little of the information is there, other than the word blindsight at the top, right? So the actual information is not there. Now imagine if the original image, so I'm going to ask people to do something. So if you close your eyes and try to imagine that first image that we all saw, okay, the first image of the person and their body shape, etc. Okay, and just imagine what that evokes in us, that image. Okay, now when we have our eyes closed, we're actually not seeing it, right? We're not seeing that image because our eyes are closed. But most of us can conjure up a sense of something, based on our memory, right? We can conjure up a sense that we saw something, okay? And that something that we're sensing it's not the same as blindsight, but it's the closest analogy, the closest signal that we sighted people can come close to use to imagine what type of sensation a person would have. Okay? Although it's not the same thing, because in this case, we have a full awareness that we're seeing something. We're consciously aware of it. But think about it as if that image that you're seeing in your eye's memory, right, that memory of the image, if that were not in your consciousness, but you had a sense, for example, if you had a sense that you don't see anything, you don't remember the picture, but you have this sense that you saw a person. You could swear, like right now, the image that's in front of us, we don't see the person, but you can swear that there's a person there. It's just too dark to see, but there's a person really there. That's the sense that the person has, not consciously, but subconsciously, they have that sense that something is there. And again, it is difficult to explain and to feel, but I don't know, that hopefully that gives people a little bit of an understanding. So let's stop here. And what I'd like to do is, if we want, we can either do. Shrikant, do you think we should do questions or?
Let's do this. I want to make sure that it is the whatever you have said is clear to people. So at this point, let's take clarificatory questions. Anybody who wants to ask any clarificatory questions, go ahead and do that. And then we're going to, what we're trying to do today is we're trying to make things extremely interactive. Okay, so just clarificatory questions right now, not your opinions, not questions about other topics connected to neuroscience, just trying to say, okay, what did Sanjay say? I didn't get that. Okay, those questions. Then we'll go into breakout rooms for about 15 minutes, 20 minutes, something like that. And then we'll come back with, we'll give, Sanjay has some ideas of what we can talk about in the breakout rooms. So folks, if you have questions, go ahead and type an exclamation mark in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom. We're going to start with, I think Andrea had a question. So Andrea, would you say that this is it a clarificatory question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not certain it's a question. I guess I'd like, 2 seconds of input from Sanjay about whether or not you believe that there really is a mystical side to this.
Sure. So this one we will deal with in the Q&A session.
Okay.
I'll keep track of that. If I forget, please raise that up again. We'll deal with it at that point. Folks, what we do is that we are very structured here so that we can explore the topic. And we have structured it so that towards the end, we are just going to open it up. So anything related to the topic can be brought in at that time. Dave, what's your question?
Yes, Shrikant, and thanks for Sanjay. I think I have some supplemental information. I saw a program, I think about a year ago, I think on the brain, and saw an example of this in a little different situation. I'd like to bring it up if Sanjay and you wouldn't mind.
As long as it is short, go ahead.
Yes, it was a supposedly totally blind man, and the video was shot in a low light situation. There was an attendant or someone holding his arm as he was walking, and I hope not to scare him, but I think just for safety in case he stumbled. It was a hallway maybe about 5 feet wide, and I think he went about 10 feet or so, and there were like shoe boxes on the floor. And this man, I assume is a man, kind of was sauntering along, shuffling his feet, but he maneuvered around every one of them successfully. And I have a dear friend back in Kansas whose husband lost his sight, and he would go out walking in the neighborhood. She was very fearful. But I also note that I've seen blind people walking, with a cane and a metal end, they just tap. And the fact that this might be that they have a consciousness beyond seeing. And my explanation is, nerves have multiple endings. And I wonder if, Sanjay, if there's one way it might be going into a different section of the brain that then controls the muscle, but doesn't get into the visual interpretation portion of the brain. But apparently a person is able to see even though they're blind. Thank you.
Sanjay, you want to address it quickly?
Yeah. So something to understand. I didn't want to go into too much detail with vision, but this asks specifically about that. So when we think about vision, we usually think about all of that information going into one, primarily the visual center, the visual cortex. But actually, that information, in that first diagram that I had, there in the center, there's a lot of splitting of that information, and what it didn't show is that the information also goes to the hypothalamus. It goes to many other parts of our brain, including the cerebellum, which handles a lot of emotion. It goes into emotional centers. For example, when we think of the type 1, type 2, system 1, system 2 response, right? So where we have very rapid, almost emotional response to, let's say, fear or let's say threats. The reason why that happens so quickly is because while our visual system is busy processing and it takes milliseconds and sometimes seconds, that information has already reached our lower regions of the brain, the emotional centers of the brain. It's already made a quick decision. So that information that goes from our eyes actually goes into many parts of our brain normally. But the notion of blindsight, and this is the explanation for why blindsight exists, is that all of those other regions of our brain are still getting that information, but the visual region is not.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Madeline, Goran, Jyoti, Marco, and Mike. Madeline, go ahead.
Yes, this is a question about the material that Sanjay just presented. The different types of vision, say one might be color and texture, or another might be high contrast like light and dark. It just wasn't clear to me if you meant that people who are entirely blind can have, a consistently selective type of blind sight of one type, or if you were saying that people can lose different types of vision and retain others.
So, and again, there's such a wide gamut of experiences in blind sight. It's very difficult to generalize and say that one thing applies always. So some people, and I can only do this by giving examples. So some people, and even the examples are going to be difficult because, again, blind sight doesn't always cover the entire field of vision. It can be just a localized area. Or it can be in simply one eye, in one hemisphere. Depending on what happens. So depending if it's damage in the brain, parts of the brain, that can affect things like contrast separation. It can affect things like motion sensation. It can affect very specific things like facial recognition. Even the notion of so face blindness is a parallel. It's not the same thing as blind sight, but there's one of the videos that I had linked to was this concept of face blindness, where people see faces. They see everything about a person's face, but they don't recognize who that person is. Even if it's their own relative that they live with for their entire life, they cannot recognize a person. So that's a different characteristic. That's not face blindness, but the gamut of anomalies and experiences in this is so broad. It's very difficult for me to answer that. But in general, well, I mean, it really first, by looking at the brain itself, we cannot tell the effect that it will have on that particular person. We can only ask them. And sometimes if it's very subtle, they have to undergo specific types of testing to understand exactly the characteristics of their blind-sightedness. And even then, the scientists may not actually uncover all of the different levels. They will only find the areas that they've investigated. So there's no pattern or rule around it. It can be specific to characteristics of vision, or it could be specific to characteristics of processing, either or even both. In the worst cases, but they always have an awareness that information is going into the other regions of the brain. So eventually there is an awareness, not conscious awareness. There is a subconscious awareness that they can access. Through questions like guess. Like if you ask them to guess, that's in effect what they're doing is they're accessing those other parts of the brain.
Thank you. Next up is Goran, followed by Jyoti. Goran.
So Sanjay, question is about silent migraines. I experienced those few times in my life. The effect was partial visual field deletions with some zigzaggy flashing lines. So I wonder if that's equivalent to temporary this blindness thing. If so, I can devise the experiment and do it next time it happens. Or is it a different effect?
I don't know. I can't really say if it is the same. For my what I understand of blind sight, it's not. It doesn't sound like it would be the same thing. So let me just explain. So I mean, if you have any kind of headache that causes visual effects, what basically is happening is the blood flow to those regions of the brain are being either truncated or it's obstructed in some way temporarily. It may be a diminished amount of blood flow, but so in a sense, what happens when we lose consciousness is the same thing, right? When we lose consciousness, the amount of blood going to or the amount of blood circulating on our brain and the energy available to our brain reduces, and that's why a person becomes conscious when their blood pressure drops. So in that sense, the blood pressure has dropped in just a localized region. So I don't think it's not blind sight because well, it could be if it's very, very specific, but I don't know how you can have I mean, theoretically it could be, but it would be very strange for you to have occlusion just in one, let's say, you know, one region, you know, arterial.
That's how it
path.
works. That's how it works. You know, silent migraine portions of the visual field are deleted for 15 minutes or so.
Right. Right.
Thank you. Let me go because let's continue on this topic. I want to get as many questions in as possible before we can go to the breakout rooms. Jyoti, Marco, Mike, and DLJ. Jyoti.
Hi, Sanjay. Were you saying there's a relationship between perception and consciousness? Or I didn't understand that.
So, I mean, I didn't go into that yet, but that's something I'd like to go into as part of the discussion. What I said is that the people who have blind sight, they don't have, they have perception. Well, they have sensation, right? Sensation is where the physical stimuli, light photons from the world is entering their eye. It's going into becoming signals in the brain, and the signals go all throughout their brain, and the level of perception is kind of iffy. That's questionable because there is perception, but it's in the non-visual areas of the brain. They have, again, if you ask them to guess, they usually give a correct answer. So they do have a perception of what is in front of them, what they're seeing, but the perception is limited, especially from the aspect of consciousness. But that's something we'll go into a little more during the discussion.
Thank you. Next up is Marco, Mike, and DLJ. Marco.
I'm not sure if it was covered. Came in a little late, but basically, like how are you perceiving without seeing? Without that's it. Yeah, like how are you not seeing? How are you perceiving without like a visual? Yeah, how is it reaching the brain without going through the eyes, basically?
Okay, well, it is going through the eyes. Okay, and are you finished? I don't know. I didn't want to.
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt.
Yep. Go ahead.
So the information in front, the visual information is going through the eyes. It does go into the brain, and as I said, it goes into multiple parts of our brain. So information doesn't go into only one area. Information, our brain has evolved, millions of years, and actually earlier I talked about, our having multiple brains. That's one of the reasons, because our emotional area of our brain wants to know what's around us even before we've analyzed and figured out, oh, that's a lion because it looks like this and because I see those are teeth and etc. Even before you do that complicated processing of the scene in front of us, our emotion, the amygdala and other parts of the central part of our brain makes a very, very snap decision, a judgment of what it is that visually is entering our eyes. So it does go into parts of our brain, but the realization part of it, which happens from the rear, the occipital area, that's where the slower processing happens. That part is lacking because of damage usually. And because that part is lacking, then the conscious awareness of it seems to be that's I'm assuming, I'm not saying that's known, we really don't know why that happens, but it seems to be that because the processing in the occipital area is lacking to sufficient level, that information then probably never gets into the regions that involve consciousness.
Thank you. Next, Mike, DLG, and Addy. Mike, what's your question?
I'm interested in further detail on how images are represented internally and how they are retrieved, even if they didn't come from the eyes, but they came from your imagination, or you compare an image that you're seeing with an image that you pulled up from past history. And along those same lines, that internal representation, we often say, NLP wise, I can see what you are thinking. I hear what you're saying. And along those same lines, graphic images and descriptions in books that were written by Helen Keller, who never saw, but because culturally, from what she's read, she came up with a cultural representation of image so that from other cues, she could build images in her mind and even draw pictures. So I just wonder that she could never see. And I wonder to what extent the internal data representation and how many, and if you can do all that, if a neuron is a single bit, can you do all that in 10 to the 12th bits?
Okay, so yeah, I went a little bit of this in a prior talk about vision. And there's two parts to the question you asked. One part is what happens in a normal visual center, and the second half is what happens in the other parts of our brain, which also take in visual information. What happens in our normal visual center is actually it's very logical, because if you think of a projector, okay, the screen of a projector where you're projecting an image onto this flat panel, the way that the image projects is very similar to how it projects into our visual, especially the V1 areas. And a slide I had a while back, not today, not tonight, but in one of the earlier presentations, it showed it, but I didn't elaborate too much on it. I don't want to do too much of it right now also, but basically within the matrix of neurons in the V1 area and surrounding areas, the matrix of neurons do form almost a sort of a screen, like a projection screen, where the image that's in front of us maps directly onto that screen. Except the density of mapping, as you talked about, in terms of a single photon to a single neuron, probably is not there. I mean, we don't know exactly the level, but it doesn't seem to be a single one-to-one mapping, and it's not that simple that a single photon hitting a single color receptor in our eye would transfer into a single neuron in the V1 area. It's not that linear, but it is roughly that whatever's in front of us does map into our brain in a very, very similar topology. The second part about what happens in the rest of our brain, non-visual area, is very little understood. It's very, those are very difficult to grapple because people aren't aware of what's happening subconsciously. That's one of the challenges in research.
Thank you. Next up is going to be DLJ, followed by Addy. DLJ.
Yeah, so thank you for the talk so far. I think you may have actually answered this one already by saying we don't know yet. So you don't have to answer this now, but my question was related to, you thinking of it as an information processing system, that you're saying the input devices are fine. There's something wrong maybe somewhere in the processing. But I was wondering, so imagine it like a business, right? So operations is working fine, management is working fine. The governing body is saying, I'm not getting the information. But is it that, or is it the press secretary who's actually saying, yeah, so the governing body gives the information to the press secretary to say what they're experiencing, and the press secretary is saying, no, I haven't got the report. So is it the output device is what I'm wondering about, not just the processing?
So it depends on how you think of the brain. So if you think of so in your analogy, the management who's making the decision would be the visual center because it's trying to decide what it is that we're seeing. And then the press secretary would be conveying that information into consciousness, right? And so you're asking whether that press secretary, the transmission from our visual system into consciousness, is that what's lacking? Or is it that the processing in the brain itself is not happening, therefore there's nothing to transmit, there's nothing for the press secretary to convey? Well, it's definitely the latter, because if the processing does not happen, there will be no results to convey. The press secretary will have nothing to say. But whether it also is specific to the press secretary's role, of the information going from our visual center into our consciousness, that may be, and that's where a lot of the research has, from what I've read, it's not very clear cut yet. Okay. There's still a lot of research being done, but yeah, that's an area of active consideration.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Addy.
Thank you. My question is that, assuming that the visual system and the visual cortex are intact, has there been any findings regarding the Capgras syndrome, aka the imposter syndrome, about how a person can visually see a person but misunderstand that person for something else?
If you can, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of your question.
Yes. Has there been any findings regarding why a person with Capgras syndrome, aka the imposter syndrome, would misunderstand a person for something else? They would see a person. There's the visual system and visual cortex, everything is intact. There's nothing wrong with it. But if they see this person, they would think that that person is a thing. Something in their mind is seeing differently than what their eyes are seeing. So what would be the cause?
Right. That's, well, so you're asking about imposter syndrome and where a person sees a person, but they're not recognizing really, or they're misinterpreting the person. Those are other visual anomalies. They're not, it's not the same as blind sight. It's not related to blind sight. But I guess if I take your question to tie it into blind sight, that a person with blind sight and imposter syndrome, how they would react, well, they would not have awareness that they're seeing the person, that they're seeing an imposter. They would not have awareness of it. But if you ask them in certain ways, they would be able to give you information. So the distortion in their, again, this is an aspect of distortion of visual processing, where their brain is getting information about a person in front of them, but the brain is misinterpreting or the decision on who that person is. That decision-making ability is distorted. So a person with blind sight with that type of distortion would still not see that there's a person there. They would still not understand, even have a realization there's a person in front of them. But if you ask them to, for example, guess, that if there were a person in front of you, who would it be? Then they would answer consistent with whatever other anomaly they have.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Greg.
My question is, what is the relationship of aphantasia with blind sight? With aphantasia, you don't have a mind's eye. You can't see things in your mind.
Right. So, I mean, so people with aphantasia are unable to, I mean, the simple way to look at it is they're unable to bring up mental imagery or to even imagine visual things. But I mean, so first of all, it's distinct from blindsightedness. Again, as the previous question, these are distinct, problems of visual processing. But aphantasia may be more. It's believed to be more a problem with memory recall, and how that integrates with the creation of an image, in the visual system. But it's not, from my understanding, it definitely doesn't seem to be related to blind sight, because the ability to recall images is very different. I mean, a person with blind sight would be able to recall images if they had sight at some point in their life. Let's say early in their life they did have sight and they have an awareness of what it means to see things. Let's say they have mental memories, image memories of people that they loved, their parents or other people. Then later in life, once they had blind sight, they would be able to imagine those images still. But if they had aphantasia and blindsightedness, then they would not have both of those. So they're distinct.
Wonderful. So folks, I think Sanjay, how about we do breakout rooms for about 15 minutes?
Okay.
Do you have any prompt questions for the first breakout rooms?
Yes, I do. So let me, I'll post it in the chat, and also I will just let me put up on the slide. But so the first one, I just need to copy and paste it. Okay, so the first prompt is there, and I don't know if I should. Do you want me to put it up on a slide? If
No, I think typing in is good.
Okay. All right.
And then we can.
So let me just read it for those who aren't able to see it. So the first question really is you know, I described what blind sight is. Blind sight is when we're unaware of real physical things around us and real sensations entering our brain. Okay, and the conundrum is that our consciousness is unaware of those real things, yet at some level we know, the person with blind sight knows what's around them, the physical things in the world. So what does that imply to you? What does that tell you about, you know, this level of, and this is getting into the consciousness aspect of it. What does that mean to you? So that's the question for us to discuss in the breakout room.
Okay, so we've got the question, and folks, what we're going to do is, again, the rules in the breakout rooms are very simple. Keep on topic, be brief, speak your mind, but do so courteously. You know, in the breakout rooms, Sanjay, Mike, and Madeline will be facilitating the breakout rooms, and we will run the breakout rooms for about 15 minutes. And when we come back, you can come back with any questions that you have. Try to come up with the best questions, and we will have one more round of questions when we come back. And Sanjay will have more things. Okay, so this is a way of doing more interaction. Starting the breakout rooms now. Welcome back. All right, so it's time. Let me ask Sanjay. Sanjay, how do you want to proceed?
So we can do, I mean, there's just a few more, not slides, but there's a few more ideas that I want to present. Not ideas, but examples and clarifications. It doesn't have to be now, it can be later.
Let's do it later, because I want, you know, whatever is the result of the breakout rooms, it would be good to hear from people at that point, and then we can go from there. Brent, did you have something?
Yeah, I can mention one thing really quickly here. I saw a video about, it was either the CIA or the NSA, and they train analysts to look at pictures, satellite pictures, to pick out missile silos and bunkers and things like that. And so that's what these guys do all day long. They discovered that if they took all the pictures that that person was going to look at that day and flashed them on the screen really fast, like maybe 10 a second, bam, 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 they discovered that the efficiency rate of those people went up dramatically because their brain took in all that information that they couldn't possibly digest that quickly. But the brain still took it in, and it had a demonstrable effect on how accurate they were in.
Brent, you need to unmute again.
So that is an example of blind sight, isn't it? Where how does this working? I don't see what's going on, but nevertheless, the information is going in there, and then it's useful in the future. I think that's a perfect example of what we've been talking about.
Folks, Sanjay, you go ahead and respond to it, but I want to let people know this is a time you can ask any kind of little bit more broader questions if you want, related around the same topic, but anything that might have come in during the breakout rooms. So we'll do a little bit of interactivity. Go ahead, Sanjay.
So I just wanted to comment on Brent's comment. So the description you gave with CIA analyst or any kind of analyst, I wouldn't say that that's the same as blind sight. I mean, that's very rapid processing, where the people are aware and they would have a conscious awareness of what they're doing, what they're involved in. They would be able to describe things at a cognitive conscious level. It's not the same thing as blind sight, but I can see where, why you're seeing it that way. But blind sight is where the person really doesn't know they're seeing anything. I mean, it's not that the awareness of sight is short-lived. In the example you gave, the awareness of sight is short-lived, meaning they're aware that something flashed in front of them. They're not able to pinpoint and describe all of the different aspects of it, but they're aware that there was a flash of an image, and that's why it's not the same as blind sight.
Thank you. I want to ask a question, slightly broadening the discussion. You started by talking about the right side and the left side of the visual field and how it is processed differently. That's actually very stunning. So the question is, can you actually use this fact that the thing that you're going to see on the right-hand side is going to be processed more logically, and on the left-hand side is going to be processed in a more holistic, intuitive, almost a subconscious way. Can this be used? Has this been used? Go ahead.
So, I mean, your question is specific to Blindsight or just more broadly?
More broadly.
Okay. So, I mean, I mean, the patterns. So one of the things that and this is my take on it, is that a lot of the research that's been done in this area with left versus right hemisphere processing, it shows there is a difference. It also shows that both hemispheres in effect work together, but there is a lateral dominancy in certain areas, for example, logical or more general, more intuitive processing. But the reason is not clear. And the reason, there are many reasons that it could be that way. It could be that we're naturally born that way, that our brains really are specialized. The two hemispheres are specialized for some reason. And important point is that it's not always the left is logical and the right is. So it depends on which population you look at, and if they're left-handed or right-handed, it's a little bit different in those populations. So about 15-20% of people actually it's reversed. And in the left-right people who are left-handed, it's actually a greater percentage. So it's not a fixed thing that every person's left hemisphere is logical or more logical. So that's one aspect, is it might be biological, it might be genetic. It might also be that we our socialization, that we the way we learn, the way we teach, the way we process things, the way we communicate things does this. So for example, more people are right-handed on the planet, and so that automatically causes us to behave in a lateralized way, that scissors are made, or at least they used to be, now they're trying to, they're made in more equal way. But many objects, many communication styles, many things in the world are lateralized automatically, and that may be a mode, that may be a vector which causes a child who's learning from a person who's using lateralized thinking, that trains that child's brain to mimic the same thing. So it might be learned. It could be a combination of these also, or there may be something completely different about it that we're not aware, we can't explain. So it's a fascinating topic. But this is not something I've done a lot of reading or research on. I don't know the depth of it. There may be, I mean, although I have looked at, I mean, within the last year, I've delved more into this area to try to understand exactly what type of latest research, what the latest research is finding. And I don't see anything that conclusively says that it's definitely one cause. What the causation is definitely this. I haven't seen anything like that, but so it's still an active area. But I don't. Anyway, let me.
Got it. Thank you. Next up is going to be Addie, Mike, and Vanessa. Addie, what's your question?
Yes, before bringing up my question, I would like to comment on the different hemisphere of the brain. There are studies that have shown that, like, for example, if a person who has seizure, and if the corpus callosum, which is the bridge between the left and the right hemisphere, is cut, these two hemispheres will still work like those who have the corpus callosum intact. So I just really don't know how that works. Maybe Sanjay would be able to answer that in a little bit. But my question regarding the blind sightness is that I'm just wondering about whether blind sightness is a symptom or is it a disease? Because like when I heard of the description for blind sightness, that they're not aware that they're seeing anything, awareness is short-lived. This really reminds me of a disease called Alzheimer's disease, because like a person with Alzheimer's, they are also not aware that they're seeing anything. Like for example, a key on the table, and their awareness is so little. For example, if the person wants to go to the car, but they just see the key, but they immediately like not aware that they don't have the keys with them anymore. So they don't they would not be aware that they see anything, and
Thank you.
and that awareness is short-lived. So I'm just thinking about the hippocampus. Something might be going on with the hippocampus that have those types of like amygdaloid plaques and tau detangulations, stuff like that. That might be like what people with blindsidedness have.
Thank you, Eddie. Go ahead, Sanjay.
Okay, so I mean, the first thing you asked about the corpus callosum, and if it's severed in people with seizures, what you've read about is that their brain still behaves in ways where the corpus callosum is still intact. And I mean, I'm not going to, I can't comment in detail about that. That's not something that I've done a lot of reading on, but I mean, our brain is connected in many ways, not just through the corpus callosum. Through the brainstem, actually, there's a lot of integration between the two hemispheres also. So the information can flow in many, it can take many paths. Also, the corpus callosum isn't just one large bundle. It's actually a whole mesh of bundles between the hemispheres. So it's, I'm assuming when you say the corpus callosum cut, the entire areas are cut, which would be pretty drastic. But yeah, I mean, that's understandable that there would be information still migrating between the two halves. The other part you talked about with Alzheimer's, you equated that. I think with Alzheimer's, when people are not aware of things, it's not the same as blindsight, because it's definitely that their sense of cognition, their sense of understanding of the world, and also their sense of consciousness, not their consciousness itself, but their sense of consciousness is affected. And a lot of these things are in the prefrontal cortex, in the frontal lobe specifically. That's an area that degrades, with Alzheimer's in many areas. You talked about the hippocampus too, and that's an area where, because of memory and a lot of these higher level functions, they go through there, and then they split off and go into other regions. So, Alzheimer's and these neurodegenerative diseases are very, very complicated. I wouldn't say they're the same things are happening with blindsightedness. Blindsightedness is a very specific thing where it's mediated by the visual system. It's specific to the visual system, and the impact of blindsight, the impact of damage or disruption in the visual system causes a disruption in cognition, but it leaves the flow of information into the other regions of the brain. It's very specific. And in Alzheimer's, it's very different.
Thank you, Sanjay. Next up is going to be Mike, Vanessa, and Madeline. Mike.
During the breakout session, Sanjay, you spoke about whether consciousness was needed for our visual processing, for most of what we thought of as visual processing. And we started to talk about whether a self-driving car would be more effective, would do a better job if it were conscious. From that viewpoint, I think we have a unique set of circumstances because our brain and our body is made of meat and oatmeal, while the operating system of a computer is made of silicon and doesn't have, it has a different set of health and safety, and it devotes maybe 2/3 of its thinking to its own health and safety. Do we need to be conscious to do anything that we do, like play chess or balance a checkbook? Or is that just an emergent property that we don't quite yet understand? Thank you.
So just a quick comment. I mean, so on the self-driving car and it using silicon versus us using oatmeal, the example, protein basically, and I don't think necessarily there's any difference. The material that it's made out of, I don't think matters. It's because, as we've seen in neural networks and those areas, the complexity arises out of in the same way that it arises in biological systems. the number of neurons that you have, whether they're artificial neurons or real neurons, the number of neurons is what adds a lot of these functions. I believe that's my view.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Vanessa, Madeline, and Goran. Vanessa, what's your question?
Okay, Sanjay, if it's possible, let's say if someone's heightened with maybe the vibrations of a drum, and they were watching like the video of a marching band, and if they were like narrated back and forth, like having a conversation, it would be similar to someone recalling a dream. You know, if they're not impaired enough that so they could recall enough versus just simply moving the arm around. And if that's too complicated to answer, could there be a fix down the road similar to a cochlear implant could bring back some feeling of hearing? Maybe not to the possibility, but there's something that can be done to lessen the impairment.
So yeah, I mean, so you know, we're talking about blind sight, but this, and I said earlier that the exact same thing can happen in other senses. So if we're talking about hearing, yeah, I mean, there are comparable things that happen to people who have loss of hearing, or who perceive themselves as having loss of hearing. Actually, in if you know of anyone who's going through loss of hearing, you're going to see a lot of similar symptoms where they're probably not aware that they're able to hear. But if you ask them a question about something that they believe they didn't hear, a lot of times they actually did hear it, or they heard, you know, some sense of it. So there are comparable things in other sensory modalities.
Thank you. Next up is Madeline, followed by Goran. Madeline.
Yes, Sanjay, thank you. This is a question that I'm not even sure how to ask. I liked DLJ's analogy of the press secretary. So let's say that the press secretary is defective in reporting to the consciousness about the information that has been gathered in the visual center. But somehow that information is getting through anyway. Why do we need a press secretary? If people are able to access that information without one? And could we say that maybe the press secretary and consciousness are at least overlapping, or the press secretary is a subset of consciousness, and that it has sort of patchily gone out, kind of winked out?
Okay, so I like the question because you're delving into areas that I'm interested in, but also it's difficult to talk about because a lot of it we don't really know. But you know, the part about the press secretary and the consciousness agent, right? The agent of consciousness, both overlapping. That's seen. That's actually seen oftentimes, and there seems to be overlap. And what that means is the communication of information within the brain. And our awareness of that communication. There's overlap, and not just that. Specifically, there are reasons because what we've seen, what we've found so far, what the literature shows so far is that if you think of the physical model of consciousness, and most neuroscientists do, they think of that they use that model. Consciousness exists in not just one region of the brain. It exists in multiple regions of the brain which work together, which communicate regularly, almost instantly, all of the time together to give us this sense, this feeling, right? This realization of consciousness. And so this press secretary is the aspect of communication. So in that sense, maybe that communication between these regions of consciousness is a part of that press secretary, which also taps into communication from other parts of the brain. So for example, the visual center may not necessarily be talking to the frontal lobe, which is the primary part, understood to be the primary part of where consciousness resides. The visual center may actually be talking to areas in our parietal lobe, which is closer to the visual center, because it's easy for it to communicate there. It's distance-wise, it's much quicker. And those areas of consciousness then further relay the information to the frontal lobe, which gives a more holistic understanding of consciousness of what's happening. So I mean, it's a valid, a very interesting question. I think it's more complicated, more along the lines of what you're saying. But if other people have thoughts on it, yeah, that's what I'd like to hear.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Goran, Anton, and Mike. And then once we have had all the questions, we can go ahead and open it up to see what we're going to do next. Goran, go ahead.
Okay, so my question is about the qualia, the subjective experience, that element of consciousness. Okay, it doesn't seem to arise spontaneously just because of complexity of processing, because there are a bunch of complex processing that's happening that I totally do not have any qualia associated with, right? And in case of blind sight, same situation. Most of the processing is still happening, but there is zero qualia there. So I hope that AI would become conscious one day, just because the rising complexity doesn't seem to be panning out in that light. So why would one part of brain doing certain complexity of processing produce qualia, and another part of brain maybe doing even more complex and more processing would not produce qualia? That's a total puzzle for me. If you have any insight, that would be appreciated.
Yeah, I mean, you're asking me to go deep into consciousness or understanding of consciousness, especially my understanding, and I'm willing to do that, but it's going to be hard to explain without having talked about other things. So just to touch on, I mean, there are two primary theories of consciousness, right? And I'm not going to go deep into those, but basically, what I want to say is that when you're talking about processing, right, it's not necessarily the type of processing that elicits consciousness, or even the extent of processing. I'm trying to think of the right word for this. The magnitude of processing. Okay, it's not necessarily the type of processing or the magnitude of processing that evokes consciousness. I believe. It is more along the lines of the amount of processing real estate, the amount of the magnitude of fundamentally they're neurons. But if you think of it, I'm trying to think of another example that might make sense. So we have this concept of consciousness in the human community, right? That we have this word called mob mentality, right? And what that basically means is when you have a mob, when you have 50 people together, they take on their own level of awareness and understanding and, in a sense, consciousness, right? And if you have a larger group than 50, it can be even more complicated. And the level of consciousness, if you have 1,000 people, let's say, the consciousness of those 1,000 people collectively would be more complicated than the consciousness in just 50 people, because in those 1,000 people, you may have pockets of consciousness that are different across those 1,000. And you may have that. And what we see happen is that a small subset of those 1,000 have one feeling, like they let's say you're looking at a football game and these 1,000 people are sitting in the stands, right? So out of those 1,000 people, one group has one emotion, and that emotion waves through the rest of the 1,000, so that consciousness moves through. So what I'm trying to explain is the number of people that make up this crowd, that make up this mob, you might say, is very important to the complexity of the consciousness that you have. If you only had 50 or if you only had 10, you would not be able to have very elaborate consciousness. I think we can understand that. So by the same token, the number of neurons and the minimum number of neurons, there is a minimum number. So that's when you talk about, we don't see consciousness in non-biological systems emerging. That's because we really don't have that many neurons in those systems. Those systems barely reach 1 billion neurons, or equivalent.
10 trillion in a new Chinese thing.
No. So that's why I want to clarify. Comparable to animal neurons. Okay, you know, in the computer sense, or even the hardware sense, you can construct something that acts as a neuron, but it's actually not, in terms of complexity, it's not as complex as a biological neuron. Biological neurons don't just have a single, they're not a single switch that a signal goes in and then it goes out. There's roughly 30 different neurotransmitters that simultaneously operate on that single neuron. So the level of complexity we haven't reached.
Thank you. Next, by the way, Goran, fantastic question. These are the kinds of questions we want to handle. These are very difficult. Consciousness is an incredibly difficult topic. So what Sanjay is doing is that he's breaking it up into specific areas like blind sight and trying to zero in on that and try to explain the context around that by delimiting the subject. But the plan is to keep going to deeper and deeper topics and to cover consciousness over a series of meetups. But thank you very much. Excellent questions. Next up is going to be Anton, followed by Mike. Anton.
Yeah, the question that I have doesn't help as far as the nature of consciousness. But I completely understand that Sanjay has his answers. I don't know, and maybe it's better for me to just open this up to the group, because I do wonder what other people have to say. So blindsightedness seems to be some level of subconscious processing of information, even though they're consciously unaware of it, you know, to differing degrees. And the subconscious is interesting in and of itself. But in the breakout room that I was in, what I was thinking about is what about different dimensions of consciousness? And is it possible that blindsightedness could be related to an awareness of one or more different dimensions of consciousness? I know it's a very abstract question, but that's the question that I have. Yeah.
Yeah. So the quick answer is yes, definitely. I mean, the multiple in what you said. I mean, I've talked about this in prior talks about the multiple dimensions of consciousness. The higher levels of consciousness are where we can investigate this better, because, because one, we can communicate about it a little more. But the lower levels of consciousness are, you know, as you said, subconscious. They tend to be more in the subconscious. And we humans have a lot of difficulty tapping into our own subconscious. We know it's there. And in the neuroscience, one of the unusual things is that the neuroscience doesn't see subconsciousness the way that psychology and psychiatry sees it. But all of these fields recognize it nonetheless. Subconscious is real, and the conscious is real also. But the challenge is that in the neurosciences, this distinction between conscious and subconscious is quite challenging to make, other than the simple notion that consciousness is in the cortical regions, the outer layers. Definitely it's in the outer layers. And more than likely, it's primarily in the frontal lobe, parts of it in other, parietal lobe, other areas, but primarily in the frontal lobe. That's the extent that neuroscience has gotten to in terms of characterizing this conscious-subconscious divide. But the key to understanding blindsight is that blindsight basically says that our subconscious fully sees while our conscious does not see. That's the key idea around blindsight, that our subconscious fully sees, but our conscious does not.
Wonderful.
Excellent
Thank
question.
you. Thank you. Thank you, Anton. And thank you, Sanjay. Next up is going to be Mike. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for this, Sanjay. If I recall, you are a drummer or were a drummer, correct?
Yeah.
So I just have a very brief question. When you process this and you prepare for these presentations, do you ever take something like blindsightedness and put it through the sphere of musical intelligence, like how it might affect somebody's sight reading, for example? Does that ever cross your path?
I mean, I haven't thought of that earlier before this, but so you're asking specifically about me or in general?
Well, or both. Like if somebody who suffered from a form of blindsightedness, how might it be if they were reading sheet music? Would they still be able to, just what's your general thought on that? Would they be able to produce the music?
Yeah. That's a very provocative question because one would we have to assume that if they have blind sight, that they would be able to translate the subconscious awareness of what's on the music sheet, that they would be able to translate that into music, right? That's an assumption. But if they can do that, then yeah, I think that we would see them creating, reading, and creating music. But the question in my mind that comes up is, would the music be exactly what's on the sheet? Because probably this is a question I have, because it's not clear whether, and I hinted at this, that people with blind sight don't see everything in front of them. They pick up only certain aspects of what's in front of them, and that goes into the subconscious. So will they be seeing enough of the sheet music to be able to recreate that song, that the piece that they're playing accurately? Or will they be seeing a part of it and using their memory to fill in the blanks, and still we won't notice it? It's an interesting question, and it's hard to say because, again, memory comes into play in these things.
Wonderful. Next up is Andrea.
Yeah, I wanted to mention, like, Mike, what an awesome question. I'm wondering if I don't know, Sanjay, have you had any experience with the concept of synesthesia, where people, supposedly can, like, and this is related to what Anton said also about, like synesthesia is where, like, people supposedly can taste shapes and that kind of stuff. And so it's the same information, but you're processing it a different way, and you're actually maybe putting it to a different use. So I don't know if there's a neurological modeling that results in synesthesia.
Okay, so I'm trying to think. So synesthesia. So those who might not be familiar, we talked about it a little bit in one or two of the earlier topics. But synesthesia is basically where a person can, from one sense, for example, sight, the information that they get from that one sense actually pervades and enters other senses, one or more senses of their mind. So, for example, things that they see, and it might be very specific. So, certain colors that they see, or certain shapes that they see, or it can be even more specific in that when they see numbers, the number 4 and the number 9. Okay, these specific characteristics of vision go into their brain, and it goes into other areas, and it causes other sensations. For example, the number 9 sounds to them like a certain note, and the number 4 sounds like a different musical note. Always the same. Okay, and that's an example of synesthesia. But it's not the same. So I understand. So the question you asked, Andrea, very very insightful, because you're trying to get us to think about maybe what's happening in blind sight, when it's subverting down into our subconscious, it's leaking down into our subconscious, you might say. Because in a synesthesia, that's actually one of the things. There's two ways to look at synesthesia. One is the leaky theory, that the signals that go into our brain, the visual signals, let's say, right, it goes into our visual center, but it leaks out into other areas, and it causes these other sensations. The leaky theory. Okay, so is it that in blind sight, this information gets into our brain and leaks around and goes into our subconscious? That's one concept. The other is that in synesthesia, it's not leaky, that it's that the pretty much entire brain, especially the sensory parts of the brain, are highly sensitive. They're highly they're easily activated. So when you have information like the number 4, a visual shape of a number 4 entering your eye and going into your brain, that number 4 gets represented, and it normally would distribute into a different area, because you'd have a sensation of the concept of a 4 somewhere else in your mind where you process numbers. But that would cause an overexcitement of other areas of the brain and cause you to hear this musical note that in a person with synesthesia associates with the musical note. So it's hard to know. We don't know the answer, quick answer, but it's interesting because it could be. I don't think that blind sight is based on leakiness, because the normal functioning of a normal human brain, a normal animal brain, is that all of our senses go into many, many different regions of our brains intentionally and always. That always happens anyway. It's not that it's leaking into those. It's supposed to happen that way. So I don't think that it's tied to synesthesia for that reason.
Thank you. Next up is Jyoti with her 37 questions.
Okay, I'm going to make a little summary of 37 questions. Sorry about that. Sanjay, I asked you this question in the breakout room. Can the intuitive thinking compensate for blindsightedness?
Compensate, or is that what you're asking?
Well,
compensate
in a sense makes sense for the blindsided person, in other words.
Okay. Yeah, so intuition, yeah. So I suspect the intuition is, again, subconscious. That's the key part we have to realize, that all of this is subconscious. So they have a subconscious intuition around what their eyes have taken in. But the level of intuition, that probably varies from person to person based on, the type of blindsidedness, and also it may be it seems to be based on the type of processing that is happening. So, for example, if it's emotional information is easy for our emotional area, the amygdala, for example, to process, because its purpose is to do that. So there would be strong intuition in the amygdala around what they saw. But that same information also is going into the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is not very good at processing emotional information. So the intuition there of that same emotional information would be sparse and lacking. So the answer is not, it's not a single, the intuition varies throughout our brain. So I think you're on the right track. I think yes. Quick answer is yes. I think, that's a good way to understand this intuition.
Wonderful.
But keep in mind is subconscious intuition.
Thank you. So Sanjay, can you give us a heads up on what you're planning to do with this consciousness series? Where are we going? Where have we been? Just a little bit of overview for people.
Okay. So, I mean, I've done a few meetups on consciousness specifically, but in one sense, almost every meetup that I've done has touched on aspects that are important for consciousness. Because for me personally, and I know a lot of people, this is a really, it's not just important for us to understand why we are the way we are, but it will help us to understand pretty much everything about us, about the human world, the animal world, which we're a part of. So the meetups that I did specifically on consciousness, I tried to elaborate on these concrete aspects that we know well, that consciousness has multiple levels, that exist in animals as well as humans, that consciousness changes over time as we age from infancy onward, that consciousness from person to person varies. It also varies depending on disease state. Addie talked about Alzheimer's, and that's an example, and many other diseases. Those are examples where consciousness wanes and for various reasons, many reasons. So consciousness has so many different aspects to it, and that's what makes it complicated. What I want to do is, so before we delve, eventually I do want us to have probably 2 or 3 meetups specifically on consciousness that go more depth than what we did tonight. However, before we can do that, I know there are certain ideas that I have to bring forth, and I hopefully everybody understands those ideas. That's critical, because without understanding those ideas, in theory you will get something out of it, but it's not going to be the full story of what we're talking about. I mean, it's kind of like right now when we're talking about consciousness, and the analogy that I think DLJ gave with the speaker, the spokesperson. In that analogy, everybody understood what spokesperson means. But when I started answering about the question that that Madeline asked about the spokesperson overlapping with consciousness, I suspect some people may have lost the thread because it's very hard to talk about it unless you're, deeply into this. And that's what I'm worried about, is that when we get to those three, let's say, in-depth talks about consciousness, that people will have somewhat of an idea, but not enough for it to really help. That's what I'm worried about. So that's why what I want to do is to have a lot of other meetups in between, which delve into specific areas that explain elements that are crucial to understanding not just consciousness, but cognitive processing. Consciousness is a high-level aspect of our behavior, of our mind, of our brain. So any kind of high-level processing, to understand any of those, we need to have a few more critical things that we need to go into. So those are things I'm going to go into later. But even then, it's going to be very difficult because consciousness, even when we talk about it, we all have different notions of it. One of the things that I think is important to talk about, I'm going to have a talk about, I introduced it in one of the earlier talks, but this is central because, and actually is related to blindsight. I didn't go into it tonight because it's a little bit on the periphery, but it's important. And that's that there were some studies done about 15 years ago where, and it's been replicated enough times that it's shown to be accurate, where, and this is about, the study actually, when it's talked about as an aspect of free will. But ultimately, it really is about consciousness and awareness and our ability to know what we want to do. And what this initial study, what it did is it found out, it realized, and in blindsight we see the same exact thing. What it disclosed to scientists is that when a person thinks they're making a decision, meaning when they have a conscious awareness, a cognitive awareness of having made a decision, in their brain, the decision was actually made before that time point, milliseconds beforehand. And it's very odd because what it really says is the person made the decision before they made the decision, before they were aware they were making a decision. But this has been replicated and shown very, very many times. So that's one of the things that I want to delve into and have people really understand, because without understanding something like that, it's going to be challenging to delve into the heavy topics.
Yeah, no, I wanted to say that I really appreciate this series that you're doing, because neuroscience is going through a renaissance. It's the explosion of knowledge, and it's going to mean a lot to us, all of us here. It is beginning to, but what it portends over the next 10, 20 years is really mind-boggling. I appreciate the systematic way in which you're doing it. You're trying to make things accessible to people who do not have the base, but you're kind of taking them step by step. I also like that you kind of patiently answer all the questions, and also separate between what is core and what is the side. You're also very careful about saying, I don't know this, which is, I think, crucial in navigating this. So it is wonderful to have you as a guide in this crucially important area to all of us. Do you have any kind of general recommendations on books? Suppose somebody were to say, look, Sanjay is doing a great job. This is a very difficult topic. I want to read up. Let's say, suppose you were to recommend 1, 2, 3 books, something like that. You can't recommend like 100 lists. That's not going to be practical for people. But if you wanted to recommend either websites or books, what would you recommend?
I mean, it depends on what. I mean, it's very difficult because consciousness is. I mean, the level. It depends on what level the person is. There really are. I'm trying to think of good books. I mean, actually, there's one book that comes to mind. It's called Flow. It came out a few years ago. Which it's not about consciousness, but it will help people to, and it's written for it's not a scientific treatise. It will help people to understand how information within our mind travels, and how it exists and how it affects our behavior. I mean, that's one. I'm trying to.
Let me just say one thing on that. We did an entire series on the book, chapter by chapter. We had several people who have actually worked with Csikszentmihalyi and his group on the research on flow to come and talk. So we have gone through it chapter by chapter. I'm going to put a link to the playlist for that. So that's a really great way, because I think one of the values of these meetups is to really delve into a topic. Most of the times when you read a book, you really do not get even 10% of what was there in the author's head, because you don't get the context. You're missing the context. What happens with these discussions, detailed discussions is that because there are so many people with so many different perspectives looking at the same thing, many things that you may not have noticed in the book itself, you will notice. Many questions that you did not ask, you are able to ask, and you can speak out your understanding of it and have it corrected or corroborated by other people. And all of that is crucial. So it so happens that for this book, we have about probably 24 hours of video, chapter by chapter. So again, I would read the book, read a chapter, and watch the video. So you will be able to actually do this with a bunch of people from 52 Living Ideas. Go ahead, Sanjay.
Yeah, excellent. I haven't been able to participate in as many topics and discussions as I want to with 52 Living Ideas. Last year, I was very, very active and participated almost every time you had something. But this year has been much more difficult for me. So yeah, that type of resource is invaluable. You know, where people were discussing it, they're presenting different ideas, there are videos about it, and so, you know, not just the book, but you can get multiple interpretations on that book by intelligent people. That I think is vital. Another book that I wanted to bring up, and this is a whole different area of consciousness, but and this is the challenge with recommending books, because there's so many completely different angles. It's called 17 Characteristics of Consciousness, and it's actually a more recent book. The author's name is Sonawane Alcobia. But anyway, but this book gets more into it's much more philosophical, and also gets into the scientific. For those of you who think about the quantum side of things, this book delves into those areas. That is consciousness tied into this quantum world that we talk about.
Sanjay, could you repeat the name, and could somebody just look it up in Amazon and put a link? Sanjay, could you repeat the name of both the title and the author?
It's 17 Characteristics of Consciousness. So the number 17, Characteristics of Consciousness.
Okay. And
the author's name is actually, if I can post it. I should be able to. It's I'm probably mispronouncing it, but so now let me
sure.
do a quick search, and I can post it.
Megha Sonavane.
Did somebody post?
Yep, there it is. Yep. Okay. All right. Any other book you would recommend, Sanjay?
I mean,
this is this is actually a good start. I mean, there is Flow book, which you'll be able to. I actually like the Flow book a great deal, because it deals with the consciousness in a holistic way, as being fully integrated with life itself, with health, with work, with relationships, and it just takes all those themes through. All right, wonderful. Go ahead, Sanjay. Any other comments you would like to make?
Well, I mean, I want to thank everyone who joined. This was a great discussion. We had some very good, very insightful questions and comments. And also, Shrikant, your help in putting together this group and keeping it running is fantastic. I appreciate very much what you do for all of us.
Well, thank you, Sanjay. If anybody wants to give any kind of overall comments on this series on consciousness, we've been at it for, I think, over a year. It's been quite amazing. So I am delighted with it. But if anybody has any kind of feedback, any comments, please go ahead and type exclamation mark if you'd like to share. Just the overall comments on the series. I'm going to give another 10 seconds for people to type in exclamation marks. Let's start with Goran. Goran.
I just want to say thank God for coronavirus. If not for it, I wouldn't discover this thing. There's something good about it. There you go.
Wonderful.
Wonderful. Thank you all.
Thank you, Goran. Next up is Vanessa.
Yeah, I found these quite interesting and invigorating almost. And like Shrikant said, I appreciate when you say, honestly, I don't know, or I have to look into that, or, refer to something else. So that's much appreciated, and keep it up. Good work.
Thank you, Vanessa. Jyoti.
I dare not put an exclamation mark this time.
Jyoti, suddenly 20 hands were raised in Zoom. Go ahead. No, sorry.
Nothing seems to work for me, right?
No, go ahead, Jyoti. Sorry about that.
Okay. Yes, Sanjay, you are my favorite for a reason. You make me understand things. You teach old dog new tricks, so I'm very thankful to you. That's what I want to say.
I love your perspective, Jyoti. I mean, you bring in a perspective that I mean, insight. You've had a lot of insight, and it really, I think it helped. I mean, the problem that I see is that I'm usually I try to explain things logically, and that doesn't always work. And then you bring in a way to explain what I said that is more intuitive and more holistic. And then I realized, yes, she's right.
Okay. Can I become your private secretary then?
No, I want to say one thing, and this is about the audience. I think the audience is a crucial part. The attendees are a crucial part of these meetups, because when you look at when I look at all the meetups, right? No matter how good a person is, they are thinking along a certain line, and they notice certain things and they don't notice other things. They actually know a lot about things, but they are presenting along a certain line. The questions that we get from all the great people here who keep coming to all the meetups, okay, it just shows you, it basically, because they are from different perspectives, people feel comfortable to ask questions that are important to them. They are open to kind of clearly saying what they know, what they don't know, what they disagree with things. They're able to express them fully, clearly. I think what it does is that it actually provides the presenter a great value. I know that whenever I present, firstly, a lot of value comes from just putting together the presentation. This is true for anything that you go, but moment you say, I have to say it to somebody else, you end up doing a lot more work, because you're trying your best to make it objective for other people, okay, which is always hard. And in the process of doing that, you learn a lot. So I encourage people to do presentations. So if you have some ideas about something that you would like to talk about, please talk to me. Please message me on Meetup. I'm always open to new things. But in addition to that, after doing all the work, when you put things out, if you actually are carefully listening to the questions, as Sanjay does very, very meticulously, you get a lot of value, because like you say, oh, I did not think that you could approach it this way, or this is a connection that I had not made. So you get to speak out. Also, you get to know what are the limits. You can say, okay, you know what? Clearly, I don't know about this. And I've not known that I don't know about this. But thanks to this question. So, thank you to everybody for being here. Always an honor. And thank you, Sanjay. I want to tell you what's coming up next Wednesday. It's going to be Mike. Mike, can you tell us what you're going to do next Wednesday?
Sure. Being that it's a comprehensivist Wednesday, one of the issues we have when we're balancing breadth and depth in a topic is what happens when you start to go deep and you start getting close to the core of what you're studying. Sometimes that can be a scary place. So I'm going to be discussing the difference between fear of failure and fear of success. I personally think that those are two distinct categories, and there are other times when I think they mirror one another. So I'm going to share some examples in my own life. I did a little intro video that talked about me. I was also a drummer, Sanjay, where I ran into a big bout of fear of failure, success rather, and some other examples, but I'm really curious to have it be interactive and hear from all of you because it's a roadblock. It stops us from learning at the depth that we're capable of. So I'm very, very interested in running it by 52 Living Ideas.
Wonderful. We have some other, one of the most ambitious meetups I'm doing that I've ever done is, firstly, we are studying these 3 books side by side. We're studying Tao Te Ching, Bible, Gospel of John, and Bhagavad Gita. And the way we are studying it is we are just trying to commune with the books. We're trying to say, what are they saying? And we are speaking it out. It is really amazing. So folks, if you have not listened, if you're not participated in it, I encourage you to do that. Now, I'm not religious, so I don't think it has anything to do with being religious. It is all about being human, because these were the first attempts, early attempts of people to grapple with the magnificence of our existence, the complexity, what we are admiring about the complexity of the brain, the complexity of human experience itself is a reflection of that. And that's the way you first experience it and try to grapple with it. That's what these works are. What I did last weekend was to do a meetup on the themes that I see, common themes across these 3 works, both commonalities and differences. And I found something firstly, it was very ambitious. It was tried to cover a lot of ground. I thought it worked out pretty well. The questions were great. But then I realized that there is one idea that I found to be really powerful way of going through all of these. And that is Louis Sullivan's idea of form follows function. So many of the observations that I was making about these books could be expressed in that way. So I'm going to do something really interesting. I'm going to use the same presentation, same slides, with addition of a diagram on this side. So same slides. I'm going to be addressing the same issues. These are very deep issues. What is spirit? What is matter? What is the relationship between them? What happens when it goes right? And what happens when it goes wrong? Those kind of issues. Issues about what is an individual? What is the core of us? What does it mean to have will, spirit, deepest part of us? What is it? And how do we think about it? What is a way we can really interact with one another in the deepest way? How do we authentically relate to each other? All of these are themes that these books talk about. So I'll be covering all of them, but I'll be doing that by relating it using this one idea of Louis Sullivan. So that's going to be this Saturday at 2 p.m. on the Gospel of John, which I am learning a lot from, because I had not read the Bible as of like 3 months ago. And I'm focusing only on the New Testament. And it's been amazing. We've gotten Aquinas involved there. I'm looking at Aquinas' commentary on Gospel of John, and he's just showing me what words can be, okay, at a level which I did not even know. So as I keep saying, when I read Aquinas, I conclude that I can only babble. What he's able to do with words at every level, at the intuitive level, at the emotional level, at the logical level, at connecting it to all the sensory information, social information, and doing all of that at once, which is what these books do, by the way, of this kind of a holistic way of actually speaking to a human being, which was common in the oral tradition, but is kind of lost in the written tradition, whereas you're trying to achieve only one thing, one line in a sequential way. Oral communication is far more powerful. You can see the person speaking. The person can use the tone of the voice. They can use the gestures. You have relationship with them. And all of that, whatever words are there are riding on the top of that context. It's a very incredible, rich context. That's what these books are showing us of what does it mean to actually think like that, use your mind like that. What we're going to do on Sunday at 2 p.m. is that we're going to go through the entire Gospel of John in one sitting. You can listen to it in about 2 hours. So we are going to be doing reading of it and then quick comments on it. So it's about a 3-hour meetup. It's a long meetup, but there is a value. Just like there is a value of drilling in, that's what you're doing every Thursday, just taking a sentence or a paragraph and seeing what does this mean. Aquinas is helping us drilling in and extracting all the meaning of that little piece. What we are going to do here is we are going to be actually flying over the entire gospel like the eagle, which is what John is called, the eagle, because he moves from the deepest philosophical, the broadest principles to the concretes, back and forth in order, throughout the gospel. So that's what we're going to be doing on Sunday. So folks, join us for our meetups. Always grateful that you're here. Thank you very much. And thank you, Sanjay. Good night, everybody. Bye.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.